Hello and howdy. Hi, everybody. Welcome to my channel. My name is Margaret Pennard, as you probably know, and you're on BookTube now. Welcome. We're here for March of the Moderns. As you might know, we've got our little bingo card that's all about reading books published between 1901 and 1945. And I hope you're having fun. This is the final day, the final book, the final buddy chat. So I am very pleased to welcome Donna Sinclair, who's here to talk about Their Eyes Were Watching God with us. And I have a short little bio to read, the most formal I've gotten here. Donna is an adjunct history professor at Western Oregon University, a public historian and museum professional who specializes in oral history, Clark County, Washington, community history, and politics. She lives in Washougal, Washington, just down the road from me. And her dissertation turned into the book, the topic of which is Gloria Brown herself, and it's called Black Woman in Green. So I'll put that up on the screen in the chat in just a second. But author and historian, Donna Sinclair, welcome.
Hi, Margaret. Thanks so much for inviting me. I think this is a really appropriate book for us to be talking about on March 31st, the last day of Women's History Month. So that's actually really cool. And by the way, my dissertation is actually far more than Gloria's book. What we talked about there is Gloria's story. So I'm happy to tell you about that more at the end. But let's talk about Zora Neale Hurston, right?
Awesome. Yeah. We're going to introduce the book. So my copy, the one thing I didn't warn you about is that things are backwards when you are in this camera. Yeah, so woo! Their Eyes Were Watching God. This is one of those elusive classics that I found out both of us had not read yet, and so we were very eager to dive in. Written and published, I guess, in 1937 because it was a quick turnaround, we found out in the afterword. And I usually just open up with initial thoughts, impressions, and how did you enjoy reading it?
Oh, well, I love this book. And as I was telling you before we got on camera, I listened to it first. And I'm really glad I did that because it was on audible.com. And the narrator of the book had such skill with the vernacular language in the book that it was an experience. I was a felt experience, not just, I'm sorry, I have to plug my computer unplugged. I'm so sorry, it got dark. 1 second. So it was a felt experience. And so listening to the language, which is very poetic, rather than reading it in vernacular from the time period, I think was a really great introduction. So I recommend that. And then I read the book, which was also a really wonderful experience. So I loved it. Zora Neale Hurston is a really significant woman, and she's complex.
Yeah. I hadn't thought of asking you this, but have you spent any time in Georgia or Florida and the places where it's set?
No, I haven't. I've been to Fort Lauderdale. I have been to the city of Miami for a weekend, very, very, very brief. But I could feel it. I could feel Eatonville, Florida, which is where she grew up. She wasn't born there. She was born in Alabama, but at a very young age went to Eatonville, which was an all-Black town. She was born in 1891, and so she moved there quite early. The town was about 4 years old when she and her family arrived, and her father was a minister, and he owned the community store. There were about 300 African Americans in the town, and she is someone who, grew up hearing a lot of stories, and those stories, the cadence of the stories is something that I felt through listening to the book.
Yeah, one of the things I was going to comment on is the storytelling device, or like the role of the griot, and that's something that Edwidge Danticat talks about in the preface, and I felt that before I read about it, so I felt very proud of myself for recognizing it, because I think in a lot of these books that classics or early 20th century, when I read through them, it's very foreign, and so unless I've built up a 5 books in a certain subgenre, it can be very foreign and off-putting, and I don't understand what's going on in here, without an English class in high school having prepared me for something. And a lot of times they don't pick these books. So yeah, so the storytelling thing is really good. So I, initial enjoyment. I was going to say one thing about the language, because you talked about listening to it. And I did not. I read, and my experience was that when I was reading the vernacular with the DE for the, and like the very rhythmic, phonetically spelled dialect of Florida, it was work. Like I was like struggling. And then I would get to the narration part, which is so beautifully poetic. And I'd be like, oh. It was like a rest.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah, because it was constantly sounding it out in my head, sometimes several times, to try to figure out what the words were that were represented. And then the vivid imagery and metaphors that they use are foreign to me as well, because it's a lot of rural, a lot of country, a lot of items that are both antique and Southern and out of my experience. And so that was a learning curve as well, but I'm definitely happy by the end, because, and I'll talk about that with the structure.
Yeah, it was, do you want to talk about the structure, or did you want to wait on that? Because one of the things I would like to say is that there's a couple things. One is, when I first started listening to it, I was a little confused because it starts out with Janie coming back to Eatonville, coming back to her town, right? But when I read it, I knew that. And so the listening to it was really great. And it didn't take very long because she's telling a story. But one of the things that I realized today, after having read about the book, was the call and response part of it is very clearly set up. So Henry Louis Gates Jr. talks about it going from third person to first person and back to third person. Yeah. But I noticed this morning when I actually finished rereading it this morning, I noticed that the very first line of each chapter is italicized. Did you notice that?
I don't know if that's original. I mean, that's a publishing thing, that often they'll do the first 5 words or first line.
I thought it was, and of course I realized this not very long ago, but it seemed to be an introduction in some cases to the idea of call and response. Maybe it was just the chapter I was looking at, where it's third person and then it goes into first person, although not always. But it pretty quickly moves into first person. So it sets up the scene and then it goes to first person, and then it kind of goes back and forth very poetically.
Yeah,
so, I'm not a literate person.
No, I that's something, actually, with a funny side note, that's something that when I go into my publishing software, I can do that. They have like a little code bot that says italicize first 3 words, first 5 words. And so that's a formatting thing that I think looks fancy. Right. It's not the whole sentence. That's what makes me think it's not the.
I think you're right.
But yeah.
But it is the third person piece that does that in every case. At least at the chapters that I looked at, it was the third person that started each chapter in that way with Janie. So maybe I was reading more into it than is there, which happens, right? Which
is allowed. Yeah, totally. Oh, Katya's here. Okay, well, I'm going to say hi to the people that are stopping in. Katya's the reader, the buddy reader for High Wages by Dorothy Whipple. And we had that discussion a couple weeks ago. The copy just came today. Oh, spoilers. Okay. Well, I've got my spoiler alert banner just in case. it is a classic. So yeah, Donna may not know this, but there was a tag that went around that people were doing. They were replying to the question of what is a spoiler and what spoils their reading experience. And a lot of people were like, whatever. And then some people were like, don't ever do this to me.
How do you talk about a book without using some spoilers? I mean, you can do it, but to really dig in.
Right. A surprising amount of people do it very well by talking about themes, characterization, structure, and not revealing like the plot or the, eventual release, whatever. But we'll be fine. We can talk about anything we want.
I'm sorry you're not here with us, Katya, because it's too bad you didn't read the book and come talk with us. That would have been great.
Yeah. Well, everyone can come join after they've read it or while they're reading it or while they've got their copy in their hands, whatever works. So you had said that you read Dust Tracks on the road, which is Zora Neale Hurston's biography. So were there any like key points that you wanted to put into context for us about Zora herself?
I also listened to it. I did not have time to read it. It was 15 hours long. So that's me walking my dogs, cleaning my house, doing my dishes, and listening to Zora. So I really immersed myself into Zora Neale Hurston. And now I want to listen to more of her books and read more of them. Some key points about Zora Neale Hurston. There's some really interesting things about her. She actually was born in 1891, and her father was a minister, and her mother was a little bit higher class than her father, according to her in the book, the way that she tells the story. Her mother died when she was 13 years old. And there's a really interesting scene, and I don't know if you remember Henry Louis Gates Jr. talking about both Richard Wright and Zora Neale Hurston, including the scenes of their mother's deaths and their work. And Zora Neale Hurston. So I hadn't read the afterword until after I had listened to the story. And so one of the things that she does is she is trying to be her mother's voice as her mother lay dying. And so it really struck me that she had this relationship with her mother that she lost really early. And it kind of sent her out into the world long before she should have been on her own. She was 13 years old. And then she went to school with some of her older brothers. And it's not clear in the story itself, although there's a really extensive chronology that I didn't have time to study as well as I would have liked to. And so she goes to school for a little while. She's in and out of school. So that's something to know about her. She didn't have a straightforward education, which is really not surprising considering that she grew up in Florida in the early 20th century. And so African-American schools were not good. And so she ended up going on the road at a pretty young age with the Gilbert and Sullivan troupe. And she was the main. It's such a great story. It's such a great story. She goes on the road and she's introduced to all of these people who are part of the theater troupe. And so she's out of school. And this is after, being moved from house to house and almost like foster homes. Her father married a younger woman and she didn't want the kids around. There were 7 kids. She didn't like the stepmother. And so the school sent her home on a train to her father because her father didn't come pick her up. So she felt very unwanted. And she went around with this troupe for about 1.5 years. And I think that was really a pivotal point in her life because she was introduced to the language of the theater, but also to very literate people and literary people. And she always had a thirst for knowledge. She was a great reader as a kid. So I could go on about her, but what I will say is that she ultimately went back to school at Barnard College and studied with Franz Boas. And so she was an anthropologist, which I didn't know that was coming when I was listening to the book because I hadn't read. I'd only listened to the audible.com version and hadn't read the forward and the afterword and all of that. So she studied with Franz Boas, and then she went off and studied African-American culture in Florida, Haiti, Jamaica. And so she became a folk, and I think that resonated with her.
Oh, so beautiful. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but she also dropped 10 years off of this. This is a key thing. She dropped 10 years off of her age because she didn't get to go to high school until she was almost 26 years old. She didn't get to finish, but she finished school and then she went on to Columbia and was in a PhD program and she dropped out. And I don't know the reasons for that yet, but I'm on a Zora Neale Hurston quest because of you, Margaret. So thank you.
Yay! How cool. Yeah. So we've got some comments. What a background. Exactly. And then Jim's here. Hi, Jim. It should be on your radar. Should be in your TBR. Yeah. So I was going to say something about the language that was prompted by I know what it was. So one of the things I was thinking about in terms of characters was her main character, Janie, is very well drawn, and it's a novel about self-revelation, her telling her story. And I wondered about the missing mother, because in the story very early on, you learn that the mother had a bad life and ran away, and she's not in the picture. She didn't raise Janie, the character. And I was wondering if that had any basis in life. But I think what you're saying, her mother died at 13. Was she taking it out on her? Because all these sort of like questions start popping up, because she portrays the character's mother as sort of living a fast life and having no moral compass, it feels like. And her grandmother is really the character who anchors her. And that's a whole nother level of tension and what's that called? I can't remember the word.
No, that's not what you're looking for. I don't know. I'm sorry.
Opposites, when you can't, when you're against somebody. And yeah, so that's pretty fascinating.
Well, it's actually, that's actually one of the things I had sent to you that I wanted to talk about. How I read that, and as a historian, is rooted in the sexual violence toward Black women that comes out of slavery. And so the story of the grandmother is heart-wrenching. The grandmother is enslaved. She's raped by her master, and she has this baby, and this baby is almost white. And the woman who's married to this man, who's gone off to the Civil War, is angry with her, and she hides in the swamps with this little baby. That's the grandmother's story, right? The mother's story, the grandmother loves this little baby. She goes off, that freedom's declared. This is the short story, but she goes off and raises her daughter and has high hopes for her through education. And so I think that depiction that you mentioned about her mother being sort of racy is really the depiction that the grandmother painted. But the reality is that the mother was raped, and that's how Janie is conceived. And so, and then the mother starts drinking, this young woman who felt like she had potential. But it's really important to understand the historical context of African-American women's experience, and particularly when they're enslaved, they literally had no rights over their bodies. And I know, I say that and you think, well, yeah, but there's a book that I use in my class that I just finished teaching this winter that's called Celia, a Slave. And it's a history, right? It's a monograph about a 14-year-old African-American enslaved woman who is purchased literally to be a sex slave to this 60-year-old man, and has 2 children by him and ends up murdering him. So I won't tell you what happens there, except that the court trial, obviously, like, she has no agency. So that story about agency at the very beginning and the lack of agency, for me, it really carried through the whole thing, because Janie's efforts to seek agency are something that go far and above, and Henry Louis Gates talks about this, right? Far and above what her grandmother would have considered conceivable or even legitimate. Yes.
The tension of opposites, the word that I still can't think of. The note I had on that was the high chair, the image of that high chair that the grandmother has. So it's something that Janie realizes when she's telling the story, when she's telling her friend afterwards that she was on that high chair. She'd got to that place that her grandmother thought was the be all and end all, the goal to strive for. And she felt hemmed in and cornered into this place where she could do nothing on her own. So that's the agency question you're talking about, because her husband constricted her movements and her behavior. And so there was that struggle for agency between the husband and wife in the African-American town. Yeah.
I'll let you ask questions, because once you get me started, as you can tell, I have a lot to say.
Yes. Let's see. Yeah, I saw a lot of people. So February, obviously, a lot of people had it on their list for Black History Month. Women's History, it's also good. Any month, it's also good. Yeah, it's just a beautifully written book. It starts out, as Donna said, kind of confusing, because there's like a story within a story within a story, and it starts the structural note I had is it starts with the return to the town when you don't know what's happened. Then it goes back to the beginning of the life and the 2 generations back. And then you get to the first marriage, the second marriage, the third marriage, and then you get to like the crisis, which is happened before the beginning. So it's kind of an interesting thing that they do with time, but it's because you get to experience her realization, her self-realization, and the pain that comes with that, but also the knowledge of herself that comes with that as the climax of the story. And that's very satisfying. So
do you think it's also that it's also a reflection of that sort of Griot storytelling style, right? The stories, because the stories within the stories, the lies, right, that she calls the lies, are part of the poetry of the novel. And they often tap into fantasy that is rooted in reality. So on the one hand, there's this really tangible element within the book in that her descriptions are so vivid. And on the other, there's this sort of ethereal kind of feeling within it at the same time. And I just wonder, I think that might be rooted in part. Here she was in Haiti and wrote the book in 6 weeks. The other part that I know Gates talked about, she's coming out of a love affair. So I think she's also exploring those tensions that you feel in there, the male-female tensions, the power relationships. Those are all rooted in what she's actually experiencing at the same time. At least that's how I read it.
You're talking about the author.
I'm talking about the author. Yes, I am sorry. Yeah.
Just what I was saying, and I kept thinking that it sounded like Zora, so I was trying to.
It was Zora, right?
I want to be clear,
right.
Yeah.
I'm talking about Zora writing the book. So the storytelling, yes, so she has the narrator. I am just 1 second. Now I understand what's happening.
Oh, whoops! I typed that in wrong. Black Woman in Green. I put the name of her book out, and I put a typo in it. Green. Sorry, guys.
Yeah. That's Black Woman in Green, Gloria Brown, and the Unmarked Trail to Forest Service Leadership. So Zora was able to get away with that 10 years, her whole life. So sorry to throw you off track from that structure, but I just, having listened to Dust Tracks on the Road and hearing about this love affair that she was engaged in, she's both, she being Zora, is both talking about events that have happened, right, through Janie Crawford, and a reality that she's decided not to play out. So she left because of the Guggenheim Scholarship. One of the things we didn't say is that she wrote 7 books, 4 novels, 2 books of folklore, an autobiography, and then 50 shorter pieces. And she was a Guggenheim Scholar twice.
Yeah, it's pretty awesome. And she didn't go to class when she was at the university. That's why.
She skipped. Have good conversations with people and explore ideas, right?
Yeah.
But she also ended up not making any money. She was a Black female author at a time when there were Black male authors who were quite popular and didn't care for her style. The only thing I just want to say, and by the time she died, she had a stroke. She was 69 years old. She was also working as a maid again. So classic for African-American women.
Yeah. And just the side note about the folklore and the Black male writers, the point that I thought was funny is that, so she broke off with Langston Hughes after writing a play with him, and then there was a dispute about the authorship. I'm assuming he claimed that he wrote it and she didn't. And it had Mule in the title. And then she wrote a book like not too much later that was a folklore book that was Mule in the title, and I just thought that was funny. I think it must have been like a bit of peak to have that as the title. But yeah, there was also Richard Wright. I remember hearing a rumor about Richard Wright having issues with this book because it shows a woman having climax. And I was like, you mean the part where it says she arches her back? That? Like,
I hadn't heard that part.
like see what was so steamy in the 1930s, and I was like, really? So yeah, tensions of oppositional forces.
Well, and what I read about that too was also, you know, Richard Wright, and especially, but Langston Hughes is a poet too, right? But Richard Wright wrote in a more sociological style, and that's something that Gates talks about too. And she is there are a lot of things that are problematic about what she does. Also, the reinforcing of stereotypes, and I've been really grappling with how much is she actually reinforcing stereotypes, and how much is she actually engaging with those stereotypes as a reflection of what she heard. And this is something that Gates Jr. talks about too. And to establish agency for African Americans also, because some of the things she does are not very flattering. On the one hand. On the other hand, she's also uncovering the humanity and the reality and the brilliance of people who externally might be viewed as not very bright because they're speaking in vernacular. So she's using the vernacular to do it.
Right.
At least that's how I see it.
Yeah. One of the things that I was contemplating after reading the afterword was that it was measured up against a different standard. So if the Black men in that period who were respected and went on to maintain their egos and reputations were respected because they were grappling with the Negro question, as it's called in the book, and the sort of greater relationships between Blacks and whites, it feels like she chose to not write for the white gaze. That's another trend that's been sort of talked about on BookTube, is that how creative can you be as an author to say your message without being aware and changing how you write for the audience that you know there is or isn't. And so in her case, I feel like it's not that I felt like it wasn't written for me, because obviously 100 years ago, like that's not the point. But I felt like I had to do a little more work to understand what was going on in the conversations and what the insults meant, and just like dig around a little to understand a culture that I wasn't familiar with, which is entirely valid and kind of magical. I thought this was a great example of a novel that was written for people who have been in those communities. And it's a beautiful, it goes to both extremes. As you said, it has the very practical, very in the dirt, very like down in the swamp, picking beans, kind of earth tide detail, as well as the dreamy sitting under the pear tree and communing with nature, kind of like opposites of that experience. So she shows a range, which I think is great, and I think is part of the beauty of an author who can play up and down the piano. Is they're not just like on the one note, they're not just on the sexual violence, they're not just on the power relations with another community. This self-revelation tale really felt like her terms and what she wanted to include the character, but also Zora, the author. So I really liked that.
Yeah, well, and one of the things that I heard in her autobiography is that she talked about what she called the old Negro folk rhyme that tells all there is to know. And here it is. Love is a funny thing. Love is a blossom. If you want your finger bit, poke it at a possum. Now, I'm still trying to figure out the second line, but love is a blossom. Mm-hmm. If you think about the way that she describes love as flowers and bee pollen, which doesn't sound nearly, you'd have to actually read a quote from her for it to resonate the way that it does in the book. But I thought that was really interesting because she's partly bringing in her anthropological orientation at the same time. So there are Seminole Indians in the bean fields in Florida, right? There are Bahamians who are there too. There's music as part of the whole thing. And then the whole book is kind of a form of music in some ways. So I recommend, even though you've read it, that you listen to it.
Okay. All right.
You probably don't have time, but really, it was because wasn't just poetry. it was also music to the ears. And I wouldn't, maybe I might have struggled with it more if I had actually read it first.
It's an interesting point. The format that it comes over definitely sort of
the
experience sometimes.
Okay. Well, I guess I'll say there's a line where she says, when she's talking about her relationship with her, so there's a first husband, and I know I'm not supposed to give too much away, so I'll be careful about that. So there's a first husband that she's pushed into marriage, and then a second husband who basically rescues her, but where they have these power dynamics, these really, he isn't what he appears to be. And yet he's exactly what he appears to be, right? If you aren't a young, innocent girl like Janie. But she says, there's a couple of quotes that I wanted to share. One of them was, Janie pulled back a long time because he did not represent sunup and pollen and blooming trees, but he spoke for far horizon. He spoke for change and changes. Still, she hung back. So this is her decision-making about going off with him. And that's why I thought that those allusions to the old folk rhyme were really interesting when I heard them in Dust Tracks on a Road. So there were things like that happened for me in sort of engaging with both books at the same time.
Interesting. Yeah, when I've read this, and for February I read Invisible Man, and the parts where they have rhymes or bits of song or music, it's often sounding like the vaudeville or the music hall kind of sound. And that to a modern audience now is very hard to understand. You know, it developed into blues or honky tonk or country. It sort of has this trajectory, but there's a lot of filtering that goes through before it becomes something that we can recognize. And so to see the words and try to imagine like what's the music in that can be hard. But there's one rhyme that's in here towards the end about the woman and her drawers. And I thought that was really cute. But yeah, I can't remember if it's the same place where she talks about hanging back, but there's a quote about when she decides that the second husband is no longer her thing. And it's kind of bringing me to what I wanted to mention about God. So there's the title, but before we get into the full title, there's the God piece. So I feel like at the beginning of this novel, or not the beginning of the novel, at the beginning of Janie's life, she has a good handle on what God is, sitting under that pear tree and sort of experiencing the ecstasy of the seasons and nature, and knowing that that kind of love between the bee and the flower is what she wants. And is that marriage? Is that like, she doesn't know about the social construct of that yet, but it's not repetition, but it's very close for me. When I hear the grandmother, before she dies, she's sitting there on her knees. She's on her knees and she's praying. She's like praying as hard as she can for her granddaughter to sort of make it further than she did, further than her daughter did. And sort of in this deep trance state. And you can sort of sense that she's going into a place where even in her former slave life, like this would have been the untouchable place, like inside where she was her own person, and sort of resolve something inside her. And then they say dead within a month. And that for me reflected with that spot in Janie's second marriage, when she thinks and thinks and thinks. And I think she's standing by the newel post maybe, or something. She's standing in place and concentrating really hard. And she feels something in her fall off, and she realizes it's kind of like her husband, who she'd had as an idol on a shelf, and he just sort of fell off and it wasn't worth looking at anymore. And I thought, oh, that's so good. Like that inner reflection, but also that representation of that piece of you that knows, that's the intuition, and also the two different versions of it, her grandmother and her, and how what the outcome of that is. It's so beautiful.
It is so beautiful. It is so beautiful. And I had marked, so when the second husband dies, okay, spoiler alert, but But when, well, you know, there's a third husband. So when the second husband died,
didn't stop her with the first husband.
no, it didn't stop her with the first husband, right? But I like the part where in the early part, it says Janie was so innocent, she waited for, actually, it didn't say that. I said that. Janie was so innocent, she waited for love to begin. She wanted sweet things with her marriage, right? Those sweet things like the bee and the blossom. But then later she says she knew now that marriage did not make love. Janie's first dream was dead, so she became a woman. And that harkens back to what the grandmother says when she has that kiss, you're a woman now. And she wasn't. She was still a girl. She was still waiting for that. And it's that the death of that dream that turns her into a woman. I mean, it's just, it's heart-wrenching.
Yeah.
And there are other heart-wrenching parts in there too.
Yeah. Yes. I loved that part. And then also earlier in chapter 23, the beginning of this chapter, there are years that ask questions and years that answer. Janie had no chance to know things, so she had to ask. Did marriage end the cosmic loneliness of the unmated? Did marriage compel love like the sun, the day? And so she's in that place. She's now a woman. She's thinking about like what the social construct of this is. And so she's getting further away from love in marriage, and she's still like on this journey. And I love that they use the horizon and the sun to really talk about like the goal or the achievement or the transformation. And especially later on, the horizon was really cool. I like that.
What were your thoughts about God? I have some thoughts about it, but I'd love to hear what, because that was your question that came up.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, what were your thoughts about that?
Well, this and so another book, let's see. The Enchanted April, a little bit, Precious Bane that I read for March of the Moderns. They kind of treat God as not the established state religion, and those are both sort of UK centered. They treat it as something that you find within yourself or you find within nature. And so I thought, I mean, that's kind of my own inclination anyway, so I probably find that in books more often than I should. But definitely at the beginning where she finds love slaying under the pear tree and in nature. And then it's this place for her grandmother and her that is like secret and sacred. I feel like that is the place where God resides for the character. And by the end, I feel when she's talking to God and like seeing the person up there and like asking whether he will intervene near the end, I feel like I don't really know where to put that because he hasn't been that character in the rest of the novel. So did you have thoughts on that?
Well, my thoughts about that were, because I wasn't really thinking about that, although it did kind of jump out at me that what you just said about nature as her conception of God, right? And when I got to page, it's 145, so it was after I had gotten your questions and I was thinking about it. And so she talks about, so there's other things to talk about too. There's Mrs. Turner and colorism.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But he's in reference to this. He says tea cake, actually, this woman is talking about how those who are darker are basically no good. And he says, don't make God look so foolish. Finding fault with everything he made. And he, of course, is capitalized, right? And then when I was going through it earlier, it reminded me, when I heard that, it reminded me of that discussion about caution in nature. Do you remember that discussion? Caution, yes. And I had to go back and look for this. This is where the I think some of the agency of some of those African-American men who are depicted, or some of the contemporary writers of Zora Neale Hurston say she depicts as sort of foolish. She also gives them agency. And so they're philosophers as far as I'm concerned. So they talk about whether or not, what comes first? What is it that keeps a man from getting burnt on a red hot stove? Caution or nature?
Oh, yeah.
You remember that? So then So yeah, porch talk. So then later on, listen, Sam, if it was nature, nobody wouldn't have to look out for babies touching stoves, would they? Because they just naturally wouldn't touch it, but they sure will. So it's caution. And then he says, nah, it ain't. It's nature, because nature makes caution. It's the strongest thing God ever made. Now, fact is, it's the onlyest thing God ever made. He made nature, and nature made everything else. And so when Tea Cake says, you know, don't make God look so foolish, because he made everything, I feel like that's part of the whole novel. It really resonated for me in the similar ways as you identified, also as that central core piece of where is it that we know where our authentic selves are. Particularly if you're a woman, an enslaved woman, or a woman like Janie who had no choices, and yet she made choices, and that came from something within her. Anyway, it's just there's so much in this book.
Yeah.
That the more I started analyzing it, the more I thought, I need weeks. I need to write a dissertation on this book. I can't do this.
Yeah. It's okay. We're just like touching the surface to show people that they should read this book.
Yes, absolutely. Well, it also reminded me that these porch sitters, right? These the porch talk, these guys are not only poets, they're philosophers. And you may or may not read it that way on first glance, but they're talking about life.
Right. When I was reading through it, I was thinking, okay, this is a very intentional conversation about God that they're having in a philosophical manner. I should really be getting something from this. And I was like, I don't know what it is.
Yeah.
Whenever something seems like philosophy, my mind goes, but yeah, one of the other things that I looked up and was interested in knowing more about was the insult. So that was really funny. So often humor is one of the hardest things to sort of get over the fence in terms of cultural understanding. And the humor of the mule funeral, like the whole thing was quite entertaining. And so I looked up actually the Dozens. And I had not heard of this before. Actually, I had. The soundtrack to Hidden Figures has a song where it's where she's running back and forth between the campus at NASA and running through the something da-da-da-da-da. And one of the things is the Dozens. And I'm like, what? I don't know. It's just music, whatever. And it's a thing. So the Dozens is that game that they play where they insult each other. And I was like, oh, they just keep making stuff up and like tricking people into believing that they're actually having a conversation. I thought that was pretty fascinating. And then it fed into the mule funeral and like I don't know. That was some of the fun stuff that I thought was neat anthropologically for the author to put in.
Well, and I saw that. I did too. I really enjoyed, because I had a similar, it's like, this mule, what's going on with this mule? I don't really understand. And I went out and I kind of, and I thought, oh, okay. But I felt those stories building on each other, and these stories, the lies, as they said, or the stories, right? Where they're allegories for human behavior too. And so I was when I reread the book, that's actually where I started talking about, in my own mind, I wrote some notes about power. Right. That's where I started seeing social power. So this is where Jody is actually exerting, like he's all about power. And this whole book, I saw it as all about power. So it was about individual power with Janie. And then it's also about the power of the tension between Black men and Black women, and Black men in a society that continually tries to take their power away from them. It's Jody trying to exert his power over her. And I had that same response as you, where she says something dropped off from her, and she looked inside, and then she kind of became dead to the world because of his exertion of power, but her own efforts to obtain power. And it's about gendered power and racialized power. And it's the whole book is about that. And that whole question of colorism is something she talks about again in Dust Tracks on a Road. She talks about this, but she doesn't. Part of the reason that she gets so much criticism, I think, is because she is more inclined to think that everyone has individual power, to kind of ignore those social structures that impact them. At least that's how she's painted. And the reality is she actually depicts those structures really brilliantly as she's writing in both of the books I've read. Now I have to read everything, but she portrays the ways that those things work. And then she sort of inserts the individual agency within that context. And that's not how Richard Wright does it. Have you ever read Native Son?
I haven't.
Oh my gosh.
I know.
Native Son.
I just don't have a copy. I'm going to my local used bookstore today after this conversation, so maybe they'll have a copy in today.
I found it at a garage sale accidentally, and I had just read Black Boy, and so I read it, and it was I have to go read it again after reading this and reading all of this analysis. I need to read Native Son again.
Okay, so I have like 3 thoughts that are trying to jump out at once, and I'm trying to decide which one. So the title, The Presence of White People in This Novel, or The Courtroom. Which one would you like to go through first?
No, let's do The Presence of White People because they're related.
Okay, so the points that I marked out. So like I said, I felt this was a successful example of a Black person's story of a Black person's community and not really caring about what white people are able to understand or able to relate to. And I appreciated that. But there are white people in the book. It's at the beginning. She grows up as a young girl, Janie does, in the backyard of a white family. And obviously they're associated with oh no, they're not. They're not the family that was actually the one that raped the women in her family, but they're nice white people and they live in the backyard. That's where she sort of gets her identity as being not like them because she sees herself in a photograph. And then fast forward, there's nothing until content warning. There's a hurricane in this book. The hurricane comes and they have to flee the area that is the swamp where they're doing their bean picking, and they go to the place that's higher ground. And of course there's white people that live there. And afterwards there's the drama about, let me just put it up. There we go. There's the drama about having to bury the dead bodies, and basically the Black men who are seen around are conscripted and made slaves again because they're told to bury the bodies that are around. And there's white men roaming around with guns to enforce this, which is terrible and traumatic. And then the courtroom, where they have white men and white women, random, that don't know her, that she can't trust, but she's just like going through this process because she's being tried. And that's the viewpoint. That's the points of contact that this character has with the white community. So I thought that was very interesting.
Well, and that's why I say the book is like, there are multiple levels of power throughout the book. Mm-hmm. So there's white power as part of it. The first part, the early part you're talking about, that is the woman who rescued her grandmother at the end of slavery. And so again, I've gone through it twice, so it kind of helped. It helped to listen to the book and then to read it.
I forgot that.
I caught some of those things. But when you get to the part at the end, she's doing a couple of things. She's actually reflecting the reality of African-American positionality in Florida, right? Even though Janie goes off to Eatonville, which is a Black town, and the depictions of African-Americans in that town, that's what she's critiqued for, right? Mm-hmm. They're not going to do anything. They don't think into the future. They have no long-term thinking. She actually says this in Dust Tracks on the Road. She's very critical of African-Americans. So I thought it was interesting that you identified there's white people at the beginning and then at the end. So it kind of sandwiches things. But what you mentioned about the guys with the guns, that white power is a part of the entire context when they go down and to the bean fields. But that wasn't unusual. Vagrancy in the post-Civil War era is literally written into the Mississippi Black Codes. It's written into the law. And so if you were vagrant, and you could be identified as vagrant, tea cake wasn't vagrant, right?
Right.
Right. So if you're identified as vagrant, you could actually be imprisoned, or you would have to go to work. You could be picked up, jailed, and then you could be leased out. Convict leasing was really common. So like that wasn't, this is the 1930s. That didn't end until, it didn't end until after World War II, and it didn't really end then, because we still have a higher proportion of African-American men who are in prison.
Right.
So anyway, so that is a sociological statement she's making there.
Right. That scene where Tea Cake is on the gang burying things and then decides to run away, and I was just like, and he runs away and they don't fire, and I was like, oh my God, okay, all right, we can live to fight.
I had another moment like that. Can I share a moment where I was like, especially the first time I listened, and even when I read it again, was when she's in the hotel room and the $200 and he's not coming back. Yeah. It broke my heart both times, even though I knew. I was like, no, this can't be happening, because
I believed it. I believed the worst.
Well, of course, because it seemed, of course you did, because it happens. It's actually the more common outcome would be something like that. Right. Especially, and the other thing, I don't know if you know this, but the person that she was having the love affair with, that before she went off and wrote the book in Haiti, was, yes.
Okay.
Yes. Got to make sure I get those articles straight, but or those pronouns straight. What's that?
A gambler?
I don't know if he was a gambler, but he was very young. He was much younger than her. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
And in her autobiography, she calls him PMP, but his name was actually Percival McGuire Punter. Percival. Yes, and they had a relationship that was very much like the relationship that she depicts. And so, but she doesn't marry him. She leaves for her Guggenheim scholarship and goes and writes the book instead. So she is writing, like in some ways, she's writing this tale, and and she describes it in her autobiography. He has these expectations of her as a wife, that he will take care of her. She will, her job would be to be his wife. And they had tension and conflict over that. So it all plays out in the story.
Yeah, because that's one of the most central things. If you have that attachment of self-concept to protecting another person or providing for another person, it's very hard to extricate that from your self-worth. I would think, theoretically.
But also, the gender expectations for men and women. Again, there are these multiple layers of things that are happening, and she's experiencing that. This is a person that she met, and he was a graduate student. They were both, she fell for him because he appreciated her mind and not just her body. And they had a really, really passionate relationship. And so, but he didn't want her to go off and work. He was jealous of her work, and she couldn't give it up. It was the one thing, and she says then by she, I mean Zora, the one thing she couldn't give up was that place inside of her that had something to say.
So which is sadder, the fact that she gave up her love affair, that was the person who recognized in her the spark of life and creativity, or that her character finds that love, has a textbook, the part where she says, the part where one of them's jealous, or they're dancing around something, and then one finally says, what do you actually mean? And then they respond, and they actually just say it out, and they're direct with each other. I'm like, what is it? It's like a marriage manual. So to have that kind of love and marriage, and then lose the husband to a hurricane-induced rabies, just sadder.
Well, if she had to conform to what Zora, her real life lover, wanted from her, it wouldn't have turned out that way. Unless they had this big storm and the rabies and all that, it wouldn't have turned out that way. So I think one of the things I love about the book is she has that satisfaction, and she still has this authentic life to live, and she doesn't care what anybody thinks anymore. she's going to be herself. She feels that she's had the experience that she needs to have in her life. And so she doesn't want to die. She's still in the world, but she is authentically Janie Crawford.
And the character needs God to intervene to take that away from her. Okay, new take, God.
Yeah. Well, and God is nature, right? So I didn't, the first part of the book, I wasn't looking for that. I had actually marked a couple of things, but it kind of, whereas I'm an environmental historian. And so I probably have similar feelings about these things as you, right?
Okay.
And so like the whole book is imbued with nature, because what is God? It's that powerful force within you, within Janie or Zora, but it's also the power of the world that you can't control. So
yeah,
it's really, which is sadder. I'm going to be thinking about that. Life is sad, right? Yeah. I mean, and so what's sad to me is that Zora Neale Hurston didn't get the recognition at the time. Yeah. I mean, she got it, but it was momentary. And a lot of that had to do with gender. And so that's sad. But Alice Walker kind of picking her back up and putting her out in front of other African-American authors is also, I mean, that is comforting, right? It's empowering. She empowers other women for feminist scholarship and for Black women, but also for all of us. The fact that she did this at a time when it wasn't common.
I love that she put so this is the philosophy that I could get behind when the Black folks after the courtroom are still bad-mouthing her and saying that a Black woman and a white man can both get away with anything. And I thought there's some interesting gender dynamics going on there. And I love that she put that in now, knowing from you, like, more of the context, thinking like she's had that thrown in her face somewhere. And so this is where she's putting it down, is in the mouths of people who don't understand what's going on. And I thought, yes.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting to think about, well, first of all, would Southerners have read this literature? Probably not. Zora Neale Hurston's coming out of the Harlem Renaissance, right? So after World War II, you have a large migration of African Americans leaving the South and going into northern cities. And in Harlem, there, people like Langston Hughes are there, and she's interacting with W.E.B. Du Bois. And so she's interacting with these people who are those who just are the foundation for contemporary African-American history and culture right now, because they're writers, thinkers, and she's one of them. But she's also, did you read the part at the end of the book, at the end, where there's a description of Zora Neale Hurston walking into a room, and she's just, she announces herself.
Oh, yes.
This flamboyant personality. And I thought, well, that was so interesting.
Related to the talk that she just gave, she sort of like shouts it out so that she can have an entrance. And I thought, okay, I didn't really get the word.
I actually get that. I think about my Gloria, who I wrote the book with. Gloria wouldn't do that, but she could.
Yeah.
She could, just like that. She has that personality. And it made me think about that. The potential flamboyance, but also the level of charm that Zora Neale Hurston had. Janie's not portrayed in that way. Maybe Zora doesn't see herself as quite as charming, but those qualities come out in Janie's character.
Yeah. I want to ask about whether it's partly colorism, especially towards the end, rather than charm. We have time for like another question or two.
Right. Which part? What part are you referring to?
Well, if you wanted to talk about Mrs. Turner and that bit of commentary. So basically at the end, there's a woman character who has internalized the racism and is of mixed race and values and praises white features, even if they're in a mixed race person. And so she sort of sidles up to Janie and wants to be her friend. And is okay with Janie being cruel to her, because Janie doesn't want to associate someone who doesn't like her husband, who's darker, because she expects someone who has these features and is more white, or mostly white, to be as a god, and so be wrathful and vengeance and all these things.
Mm-hmm.
And there's quite a bit of text that is spent on the sort of mini religious world of Mrs. Turner, and I'm wondering like what that is sort of meant to bleed out into. Did you have any thoughts about like?
Well, I see that as reflective of even back to the beginning, where Janie doesn't recognize herself as being Black because she lives in the white world. Zora Neale Hurston grew up in a Black town where she didn't get the same messages that African Americans living in white towns got about inferiority.
Right.
It never occurred to her. So yes, I understand your question. I was referring to Zora's charm, not Janie's charm. Janie had the physical beauty. Janie had the physical beauty, right?
Yes.
And the hair, right? Lots about the hair, but also tying up of the hair in the head wrap, right? Yeah. So yes, I agree with you. Colorism is something that a lot of white people aren't really aware of. And it creates divisions within divisions in African-American society and between racial and ethnic groups. And this is worldwide. I mean, I don't know if Americans really understand how much this, unless you're like, if you're in a Black country, then it's not the same in some of the Black countries. But throughout the world, colorism is from the colonial era. Is a really huge problem. So that I thought that was fascinating, and also the way that the men decided to take Mrs. Turner out.
Okay, yes, let's talk about that.
Yes,
I just read a passage to India, and so there's definitely colorism going on in there based on the darkness of skin and the colonial Indian context. So that's something.
Mexico, it's everywhere. Yeah,
Asian American communities as well.
Yeah.
But yes. Okay. So this is part of the humor of the book. I wasn't sure what was intentional. So there's these two guys, and I can't tell sometimes what the skin color is of the characters. And so I didn't know if those were outsiders visiting, because she names them, but they didn't seem like they were part of the normal gang. The two guys come in and have to stand up while they're eating. It made them seem more like outsiders. So I wasn't sure if like,
I think they were part of his crew. They were part of his crew.
Oh, okay. So it's a completely engineered incident.
Yes, it was complete. That's right. It was a completely engineered incident because remember, there's a discussion where Tea Cake hears Mrs. Turner, and then Tea Cake mentions to these guys, they say, "Wait a minute, she's taking our money and she's looking down on us because we're dark." And then it goes on. There's some more story, and then this incident happens.
Yeah.
And but because it's like Bootney was the name of the guy, and Motorboat.
Were those the two that came in? Because those were very close friends at the end. But I thought
they were close friends, but they were they were all in there. So I think I'm pretty sure it was engineered. Okay. That's how I heard it.
Yes, I thought they might have just like taken advantage of the moment of like. Or whatever. But yeah, there's a full-on cafeteria food fight. If you don't want to read this for anything else, definitely stay in it for it.
Right. That was so great. And Mrs. Turner really but Mrs. Turner, I mean, think about the position of self-loathing that she's in as well. And so that's a part of the book that we haven't even talked about.
Yeah. Do we have a saddest character? Do we have an award for saddest character in the story? Usually I ask for favorite and least favorite, but since we're on this thread, I think that might be a good ending. Saddest and happiest.
I think Joe Starks is actually a sad character. Mrs. Turner is a good candidate, but I think Joe Starks is actually a really sad character. The way that he died, his not knowing Janie. He could have known her. That's pretty sad.
Yeah.
What about you? Do you get to say?
I didn't think of this beforehand. I don't know. I want to put the grandmother in there somewhere. I think she's pretty happy at the end. I think she's like succeeded in her mission with her granddaughter and finds that like satisfaction of confirming her beliefs. But it's a smaller world than the rest of the characters inhabit.
But the mother too. The mother is really sad. She's barely there, but she's actually
barely there. She's barely a character.
Yeah, yeah. And my favorite, Janie.
Yeah, yeah.
Jake and Janie.
Yeah, exactly. They're such a good couple.
Yes.
Your favorite literary couple, definitely.
Yeah.
Oh, so good.
Well, thank you, Margaret. I think unless, do you have anything else you wanted? I mean, I could keep on talking about this. There's so many things about this book, but
yeah, I have final comments to pop up here. Ladies usual, but happy hump day. Thanks, JD. And then Katya saying it's really great. Yeah, and hopefully if you've listened to all this and haven't like closed your ears when you see the spoiler alert, it doesn't spoil it. I went in pretty blind and it was pretty great. I will just put out there a couple reminders. So Donna has a book called Black Woman in Green, and we've got the link up there in the chat if you wanted to check it out. It's about environmental history and a trailblazer Black woman in the field of forestry. So that's pretty dang interesting. Oh, and
it's really, I want to say it's really Gloria's story and a story of change in the United States at the same time.
Yes, and I'll put that in the chat here. And then, as I said, this is our last buddy read for March of the Modern. So this is like the wrap up of March on the last day, which is bittersweet because it's been super fun. What we have coming up for April is I'm going to talk about the takeaways from running a readathon, which has been a little crazy, but good. And then we've got the book club on Patreon, and we're going to be reading Love Medicine by Louise Erdrich. And so I just read a essay that she wrote like 20 years ago that I'm totally going to have to read parts of for preparation, like on a video sometime soon, because it's so beautiful. It's her meditation about her relationship with the Ojibwe language, and it's gorgeous. So that's just got me so much more pumped to like read this book in April. So if you're interested, I will put up the link to Patreon and where we have the details on the book club. And I think that's everything. I've just got a playlist for all the March of the Moderns to send it up as well. And then, yeah, happy end of Women's History Month. And thank you so much, Donna, for participating and giving us your expert historical context. And I'm glad I found a new historian neighbor over here on the West Coast.
Where do you live? What where are you? Oh, you're in Portland. Okay.
Yeah.
Right, well, thank you for contacting me and for asking me to read this book with you, and introducing me more closely. I've been meaning to read Zora Neale Hurston for a long time, and now I will be reading everything. I mean, all of the essays, all of the stories. She's the one I'll be carrying around in my head for a long time to come. So thank you for that.
Excellent. Well, thank you, and thanks y'all for watching. We'll see you again soon.
Bye, everybody.